Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, where we talk about the post-World War II period and this rise in what the author calls clamors for change, all the various different kinds of ways in which different communities participated in civil rights movements, and some of the successes they were able to have. So in terms of Asian Americans, some of the post-war changes that they experienced was the 1948 court, which overturned the Alien Land Law, which prohibited land ownership to Japanese immigrants. Congress rescinded the whites-only restriction of the 1790 Naturalization Law, which allowed non-whites to be able to be citizens. And in 1998, there was a congressional bill offering an apology and reparations for Japanese Americans in particular who had experienced the Japanese internment. For Mexican Americans, the GI Forum was created demanding civil rights for Mexican Americans in the US. In 1946, the Mendez case was a case that was brought up against the segregation of Mexican American students in schools in California, and it served as a precedent for the Brown versus Board of Education case. And Cesar Chavez, who many of you may be familiar with, returns from serving during World War II and begins his movement that will make him famous for farm workers' rights. Of course, well, you might be more familiar of this time period is the Black Civil Rights Movement, which included the Montgomery Boys boycott, protesting against segregated seating in buses, the sit-ins by Black students protesting against segregation in lunch counters, freedom rides to integrate interstate buses and bus stations in the South, and of course, the 1963 March on Washington. The reading also talked about the experiences and participation of Jewish Americans in the civil rights movement. For example, Rabbi Prince, who spoke during the March on Washington, wove together racism against African Americans with the Holocaust. Half of white students conducting voter registration drives in the South were Jewish. 2 Jewish civil rights workers were killed during the movement. And many of the lawyers defending civil rights protests were actually Jewish. So the successes of the civil rights movement included the 1964 prohibition of discrimination in public accommodations and employment. Obstacles to register to vote were eliminated, like literacy tests. And in 1965, Executive Order 11246 called for affirmative action in hiring minorities by companies holding government contracts, making these government contracts accessible to minority businesses. But as the reading discussed, everything, all of society's issues, and particularly the issues affecting African Americans, were not resolved by the civil rights movement. In particular, they failed to relieve poverty and the poverty that was being experienced in particular in urban areas. Poverty conditions and economic injustice were the root cause of many of the urban riots that were taking place during that time. Malcolm X was a nationalist leader who addressed these inconsistencies between the American dream and the actual Black experiences, particularly in the urban areas. The reading also talked about how in the 1980s, the deindustrialization of America created devastating economic conditions, particularly for African Americans, and a rise in dependence on welfare. The reading also talked about the rise of the model minority myth during the same time period in the 1980s, where Asian Americans were portrayed in the media as success stories and were presented as role models for Black and Latinos to achieve success. African American and comparisons between African American and Asian Americans fueled the anti-affirmative action politics in California that the reading also talked about when they talked about Proposition 209, which was called the California Civil Rights Initiative. And so what we see here is how one particular population is presented as being better at being successful economically, socially, and so on in the United States. And so instead of thinking about what are the systemic issues that contribute to the conditions that Blacks and Latinos experience in the US, they became blamed for it. So if Asian Americans could do it, what was wrong with African Americans and Latinos that they couldn't also achieve the same success? And that became the new narrative in the 1980s, and sometimes even to today. Finally, the reading talks about one of the key cases of the 1980s that took place that really brought to the forefront how the successes of the civil rights time period were ending after the 1980s and into the 1990s. This was an incident in 1992 where African-American Rodney King was beaten by 4 police officers and was caught on video. Now, today we are pretty, acclimated to seeing videos caught on tape or beatings and other kinds of abuses being caught on video, because today everybody has a cell phone with a camera on it, and it's more easier for people to capture, right, and document these incidences. That was not the case in 1992. And so when this video came out of this particular incident, where it was so overtly clear that he was being beaten by these police officers, it was a national outrage, right? It was the first time that there was this visual recorded evidence of the kind of abuse that people in communities of color had been experiencing, but nobody believed were actually happening. The officers, however, were found not guilty, even with this video evidence, which resulted in the riot in Los Angeles that lasted for about a week. The riots were perceived not just as an outrage over police brutality and racism, but also against poverty conditions in urban neighborhoods of color. It also illuminated conditions of Korean Americans living in these same neighborhoods and the experiences of Korean store owners. So this incident, as well as the ensuing riots, also demonstrated and brought to light that the conditions of racism and poverty weren't just a Black-white issue anymore, but that there were Latinos and Asian Americans, contrary to the myth of success, who were also experiencing these conditions and these pressures. So what we see at the end of this time period is that while right after World War II, there was sort of this energy and motivation around creating a more equal and democratic society across the board for different groups, that this took a turn in the 1980s into, some might argue, into today. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your comments in the discussion posts. Have a good week.